It was late October when my father told me that I would go hunting with him. I was 13, and it was the first time I had ever been allowed to join my father on one of his expeditions. Recently several cows had gone missing from our farm. A few days ago, my father found one of them dead at the edge of the property. He said it was either wolves or coyotes, judging from the bite marks. As winter came on, my dad and I realized we couldn't afford to lose any more cattle. We had to catch and kill anything that would consider our farm its new feeding ground. The night we set out, excitement and nervous anticipation swept over me. Most of the other boys in our village had already been out hunting, and they often made crude jokes reminding me that I was still just a kid. Even though there was still a trace of summer warmth in the autumn air, my father made me put on my wool coat while he checked and loaded our guns. When we were ready, he took an oil lamp from the yard and walked down the stairs. Turning, he said, "Whatever happens, make sure you know where you're pointing that thing. If I get a bullet from you, I'll haunt you forever." I laughed nervously, but the thought made my stomach cramp. Ever since my mother and older brother died, my father and I have only cared about each other. Without him, I don't know what I would do. Earlier, my father had taken the trimmings from the pigs that had been slaughtered the day before and set traps along the forest trail leading to Silver Mountain. He was sure that this was the trail where the odor from the farm went into the woods. At any rate, it was the best clue. We crossed the pasture until we reached the hedge at the edge of the woods. The moon was almost full, and its light made it easy to see in the dark, despite the light layer of fog that covered the open field. As I climbed over the hedge, my father muttered something about the trees needing to be trimmed farther back. He had to help me climb over. The rifle was a new burden for me. We reached an overgrown path, with the usual dirt trampled in the center. The path was too narrow to walk side by side, so my father walked ahead, lighting an oil lamp with a match as soon as the tall pines above us completely obscured the moonlight. I almost wished he hadn't lit the lamp. Anyway, the new light only limited the distance we could see between the pillars of pines that surrounded us. Something nearby rustled among the leaves and needles. The unexpected sound took my breath away. I twisted in place, trying to point my rifle in the direction of the noise. "Wait!" my father shouted to me. We froze for a second, but there were no more sounds. I turned around to cast my father a concerned look. "It's probably just a squirrel," he said quietly. "Don't be afraid. There's nothing here at night that isn't here during the day." I nodded to him and adjusted my rifle. He nodded back and continued on his way. A few more sounds were heard in the distance, the fluttering of wings and the snapping of sticks. As time went on, I grew calmer and less afraid of the dark. All the other boys were past it, and I wasn't about to let myself stay in their shadows. Moreover, I wasn't about to disappoint my father. "We're getting close to the first one," Dad whispered. He hunched his shoulders and slowed his step, shuffling from heel to toe. I adjusted to his posture and stayed close to him. To the right was a small opening in the pine grove. There my father had set a trap around a pile of entrails. He paused to give me a chance to catch up with him until I was right next to him. Then he picked up a lantern and stepped into the clearing. The entrails were scattered and slightly chewed. What was more interesting was that the trap had worked, catching something, but what exactly, we didn't know. Something got caught, of course, Dad sighed disappointedly, but something else got to it first. He pointed to the ivy leaves on the ground, smeared with blood. The needles around the ivy were scattered in such a way that it was obvious something had been dragged away. Judging by the size, it was either a large coyote or a small wolf. Father started to shake his head and curse. But suddenly further down the trail came the shrill cry of an animal in distress. Father's head popped up. Without thinking, he ran at full speed back down the trail and deeper into the forest. I wanted to yell at him to wait, but the noise would scare away all the animals around us, and I knew that would upset him. Instead, I ran as hard as I could to keep up. Ahead of me, the dim yellow light of the lantern flickered on and off, disappearing behind trees and brush. The sounds coming toward us definitely belonged to some kind of wild dog. Growls, howls, and screams echoed among the blackened sentries. I ran, trying to keep my labored breathing from making too much noise. I rounded the corner, and the light of my father's lamp appeared ahead. And then I heard a loud gunshot, followed by the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. My father screamed in a way I never thought a human being could scream. His terrified screams were accompanied by growling as well. I abandoned all thoughts of stealth and rushed toward the light. I screamed, calling for my father between painful, fiery breaths. Leaping through a thicket of bushes, I found myself in another clearing, lit by a lamp toppled to the ground. Oil leaked out and caught fire on the forest floor. My father lay on his chest, even in the light of the lamp. What I saw hunched over him appeared to be a creature composed solely of shadow. Without thinking, I quickly raised my rifle. Aiming the scope at the center of the creature's body, I pulled the trigger. A flash of the muzzle illuminated the animal for a moment. The only thing I remembered was the huge claws and the mouth with bloody, razor-sharp teeth. That was all I could see. The animal was moving so fast that I didn't realize which way it was going. However, I know my bullet hit its target because the monster let out an agonizing howl the likes of which I had never heard in nature. It was as if the animal had two sets of vocal cords. One was fainty, the other more human. The talkative scream was incredibly loud, echoing throughout the forest. I froze in place, shocked by what had just happened. The fire from the overturned lamp spread among the needles and leaves, turning into a large flame. The light fell on my father, who was squirming and screaming on the ground, rolling and convulsing in renewed agony. He was tearing at his shirt as if it too had caught fire. A large bite wound was visible under his collar, stretching across his shoulder from his upper back to his chest. Each fang had left a wide furrow that oozed blood and thick yellow pus. Though only a few seconds had passed since the bite, the wound had taken on the appearance of a long untreated infection. His breathing became hoarse, and in between his agonized screams, I thought I heard him trying to say my name. I rushed to him, trying to find words to soothe him, but could only repeat, "Oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God," over and over. I tried to grab his hand in a panicked attempt to get him to his feet. I knew I couldn't pull or carry him out of the woods. I couldn't let him die. As soon as my fingers closed around his arm, I felt his other hand hit me in the chest, knocking me off of him and onto my back. Immediately afterward, I heard a loud crack, and then another horrifying cry of pain. I lifted myself up and saw my father lying on his back with his chest held high. His arms were raised above his head and wrapped behind his back. It looked like he had been stabbed in the center of his back. There was another cracking sound and he rolled over onto his back. The growing light from the spreading fire illuminated a sight that will stay with me until the day I die. My father's back was not only breaking, but stretching. He tried to reach his back in a desperate attempt to somehow alleviate the agony. And when he did, his arm twisted on its own at the elbow. There was a terrible crunching sound as the bones in his arm broke in several places. I could see that with each fracture, the length of his appendages increased by several inches. This was accompanied by a tearing, writhing, stretching sound as skin and flesh strained trying to keep up with the unnatural growth of the bones. His shoulders first bent together, and then widened another 6 to 10 inches, and his face exploded as an unseen force suddenly broke all the bones of his skull, pushing his nose and mouth inward. His agonizing, savage scream was suddenly cut short, and he continued to squirm on the forest floor. In the sudden silence, I realized that I had been screaming in terror the whole time. I struggled to my feet and realized I had dropped my rifle. I stared into my father's eyes, sobbing at the unholy agony I saw in his gaze. There was a pop and his face suddenly stretched, becoming like the muzzle of a horse or a dog. He choked and coughed, apparently having swallowed something. Then, spewing bloody vomit, he spat out all his teeth. When he screamed the next time, I saw deadly spears coming out of the bloody hollows in his jaws. His scream was different now. It was accompanied by the sound of something inhuman, something savage. Suddenly I realized with a new horror that his scream was the same two-octave howl I had heard from the beast I had just shot. The skin around his eyes blackened, and that darkness spread across his face, seeped through the skin on his neck and over his shoulders. Thick shiny black hair sprouted from his flesh. In an instant, the man I was yelling at became nothing like the man who had raised me. The gentleman who had taught me to fish, ride a horse, and roll on rocks. His screams became less and less human and more bestial, and the remaining embers of my sanity brought one rational thought to my brain, the most unthinkable thought imaginable. I rummaged around on the ground at my feet and found the rifle I had come with. Tears streamed down my face as I pulled the bolt and slid the cartridge into the chamber. Sobbing, I raised the rifle and aimed the scope at the point between his eyes. Without blinking an eye, I pulled the trigger. The unspeakable monster my father had turned into was silent. My whole being went numb. I felt like I was losing consciousness, and I sobbed like a child. There was no chance of realizing what had just happened. I stared at the corpse lying before me, oblivious to the flames shooting through the pines and forest floor. I felt like I wanted the fire to consume me, to pull us both out of this dark nightmare. Suddenly I heard a howl coming from the underworld. It was a sound from the deepest circle of hell. No sooner had it ended than it was joined by a chorus of two-voiced growls. The noise pierced through my body, electrifying my spine. I didn't think. Instead, I channeled my actions into an overwhelming instinct to get as far away from the source of this infernal orchestra as possible. I turned and rushed toward the farmhouse. Terror gripped every inch of my body, and I raced at breakneck speed, fueled by adrenaline, toward the safety of the village. The light of the campfire was fading fast as I made my way through the forest, jumping over roots and large rocks. I had no idea if I was on the trail or not. I was just running. As I ran through the impenetrable blackness of the forest, I realized I was hearing more than just my panicked footsteps. A rustling in the air was quickly building up, as if something was chasing me. By how quickly it grew louder, I realized it was moving incredibly fast. In the darkness, I could still see my father's eyes full of terror and agony staring back at me, and I prayed to God not to let this happen to me. I ran faster than I could have imagined. My whole body was numb with fatigue. Behind me, the rustling took on a new sound, a fierce, predatory growl. I realized I was approaching the border of my father's domain when I saw the moonlight shining through the thinning canopy. In the moonlight, I dared to look over my shoulder. Behind me, only a few yards away, I could see the rippling figure of another dark beast on all fours rushing after me. Two more were chasing after him. I did not look back again. I was sure that at any second, I would feel the weight of the beast bearing down on my shoulders. First, I would feel its claws, and then those horrible teeth, immediately followed by the burning, cracking of bones, and the stretching of flesh, agony, horror, and the hell that would follow. The edge of the forest was catching up with me faster than I could keep up, and I crashed full speed into a hedge. My torso flipped over and I landed on my face and stomach. Under any other circumstances, the fall would have left me breathless and incapacitated on the ground, but adrenaline had me on my feet. And then I was thrown back. The beast had finally caught me. It roared, digging into my back. I groaned, but realized there was no pain. Then I noticed that the beast was not biting me, but the thick woolen cloak my father had insisted I wear. I dropped the rifle, which I hadn't even realized I was still carrying, and in one motion rolled out of the jacket. Once free, I rushed with renewed speed, spurred on by a tiny flame of hope. At some point, probably when I heard a chorus of shouts coming from the woods, the cattle managed to break out of their pen. They were running in large circles around the pasture, panicked, trying to find some kind of shelter. I ran through the crowd of cows toward my father's house. Behind me were the agonized moans of cattle being attacked by hellhounds. When I looked back, I saw that the beasts chasing me preferred lighter and more meaty prey. Without wasting time, I began to increase the distance between them and myself. I ran right past my house, determined to reach the safety of the village, the company and protection of others. My father's farm was outside of a small neighborhood. With tears in my eyes, I ran up the hillside. The light of the village was my salvation, and I raced in that direction until I climbed the hill behind my father's farm that overlooked the village. When I saw the source of the light ahead, my legs stopped on their own and I fell to my knees. Fire! Almost the entire village was engulfed in flames. Even from the distance, I was from these once beautiful streets. I could see the figures of men and women frantically running from larger and more menacing silhouettes. Screams of horror and anguish rose with the smoke and fire, joined by more unholy shrieks and roars. The longer I watched, the fewer people I saw. More and more of the beasts, my former neighbors, were darting back and forth among the flames. The howls coming from behind me made me rise from my seat again. I ran closer to the village, not knowing where else to go. I ran until I came upon a small culvert not far from the town. Throwing myself to the side, I fell into the rocky river with a painfully shallow splash. Wasting no time, I crawled through the small opening of the culvert and hid there under the road. From above I could hear the stomping paws of beasts scurrying down to join the carnage below. Exhausted, frightened and trembling, I sat in catatonic terror, listening to the fangs and claws of an absolute nightmare tearing my entire world apart. The terrified screams of friends and neighbors turned into agonizing wails, which in time were completely replaced by an unprecedented two-voiced howl.